Hello, everybody, participants watching live at the conference in Sheffield, the International Association of Chaplains in Higher Education 2022 conference, and those who are participating virtually and watching this recording at some point, either during the conference or afterwards. You're all very welcome, and I'm thrilled and delighted that two of our keynotes for the conference are here with us. Now, this keynote is the keynote being offered by Pádraig Ó Tuama, but we also have our second keynote who's keynoting a bit later in the week, Anthony, ready to join in the conversation, waiting on hand in a short while. Let me just introduce Pádraig very briefly after saying who I am. I'm Jeremy Clines, I'm conference facilitator, and I'm Sheffield born and bred. To say about Pádraig, he has been the poet, theologian, and theologian in residence with the On Being project. He presents Poetry Unbound, and he was formerly at the Coromila community as the leader there. And if there's something I missed, Pádraig, you can tell us as you start, but we really want to hear from you about borders. And I think that the way you're analysing and reflecting, contemplating, theologizing about borders is from the context of the Hebrew Bible. Maybe you want to say something as we begin.
Thanks, Jeremy. It's lovely to be with you, and it's lovely to be present, albeit virtually, at the conference of people doing such important work at universities through chaplaincy from all across the world. And I'm really looking forward to being in conversation with Anthony as well. I think there's two contexts within which I think about borders. The first of which is Ireland. It's impossible to not, I'll speak for myself. It's impossible to be Irish and not be forced to think about the question of border. The last number of years, and I suppose I would say the last number of centuries, there has been ongoing talk about what the border is between Britain and Ireland. There was an Act of Union in 1801, which suddenly said that Ireland was part of this thing called the United Kingdom. That wasn't in any way a democratic process. That was we have other words for those kinds of seizing of lands these days. And so suddenly we were within a border that we'd never asked to be part of. And then about 120 years later, there was this new drawing of a British border in Ireland, and this new British jurisdiction called Northern Ireland was created, which was a British jurisdiction for a British people. That was the express aim of drawing a border around a majority population. And so to be Irish, I always find to be implicitly caught up in the question of British borders. And that is an everyday occurrence for me to think about it. Where I live, the border snakes across the road. Some of the time the border is on one side, technically the UK, and the Republic of Ireland on the other. And Brexit has complicated all of that even more. And I mean, I am expressly, anti-colonial when it comes to the question of how Ireland is sovereign within ourselves. And the Good Friday Agreement confirms that the sovereignty of the future of Ireland is for the people of Ireland to decide. Britain gave up sovereignty in the Good Friday Agreement about the question of Ireland, and it gave it to the people to decide for ourselves under a democratic mandate on both sides of the border. And to be Irish is to be faced with the ongoing daily impact of what many people in Britain think is the past, but for us is the continuing present. And Ireland is only, I think, in comparison to many places in the world, a mild example of the everyday witnessing of that. There are so many other places around the world where that witnessing what some people call the past and other people recognize as the everyday is even more amplified and more increased and under the jurisdiction of even more authoritarian implementations. And so that's the first context within which I think of the border and borders. And then the second is trying to think, well, what do we think about borders? If I can even introduce a third, I suppose the second is the Irish language. And the Irish word for border is teoran. And that means border, but it also means limitation. And so there's a question really in any border as to what does it mean to go beyond it. When you are looking at a horizon, often you want to see what's over the horizon, whether that's the horizon of the sea or the horizon of a mountain or a hill or something in your way. You want to know what's beyond it. The eye is drawn to horizons. And for me, the eye is always drawn through the vehicle of language, and children, meaning border and limitation, really informs the way I think about borders in Ireland and borders anywhere. Because growing up Irish, at the age of 9, we were learning songs in school written in indigenous languages from all across the world, singing about spirituality and about land. And so I never trusted a map, because I understood that the map of Ireland wasn't to be trusted, because somebody had come in and drawn a border that wasn't decided by the people of Ireland. So therefore I didn't trust any map of the world, because I was wondering who drew these places, especially when I saw borders of straight lines. Nature rarely comes straight lines. So therefore the map itself is an indication of borders that are an indication of who drew the maps, rather than what it means to be a people, what it means to be a land, what it means to cross borders. And then the third, as you mentioned, is the Hebrew Bible. I'm really interested in how the Hebrew Bible speaks about border, and how the Hebrew Bible speaks about foreigner or stranger, and how a community is often revealed back to itself through the experience of the foreigner. And so somebody crossing a border in the Hebrew ethical imagination isn't about them being treated with pity, or even necessarily only compassion or only inclusion. Really, it's about them being in the position of judge, and that their experience will reveal back to the people how they hold to their ethics. So it's not, but really it's about a much more serious question to say, the stranger reveals us back to ourselves, therefore how are we being ourselves, and what does the stranger know that we don't want to know about ourselves?
And in universities, we're really conscious that we create new borders and people arrive into that university context with all the borders of their lives inherent and at times explicit or implicit in their identity. And suddenly we've created new borderlands and new environments where people either feel that they belong or excluded or can identify as being within. We even see people in chaplaincy sometimes having to work at the very border or even beyond the border of the university and get permitted within. All the time finding that some of the people that they're working with have had the borders even changed on them while they have been staying or present at that university, because they've come from around the world. And maybe even borders change while we're at this conference. Where does sovereignty over the person's border lie? And is there hope from the Hebrew Bible for this, or is there warning?
Well, I think there's multiple answers to that. Of course, safety is a particular boundary that we would always hope can be primarily protected, and the sovereignty of a person over themselves and their choice. Then there's questions about groupings. There's all kinds of fluid borders are created with groups as well. An individual is not their only border. And I think it's important to say that in a broad context, a border or a limitation, it can often be natural. You know, Ireland is an island, so therefore the water is a border. But the question is how is the border policed? How is it a hostile border? Is it easy in and difficult out? Or is it difficult in and difficult out? Is it easy in but punishing inside? All of these questions are there, and multiple things can be true at multiple times. And for me, the question about universities is really not, are our borders easy? Because that's, you know, of course you know what the answer is. Yes, lovely, go. The question really is, what are the qualities of the multiple borders that everybody's carrying, and who are the gatekeepers, and what are the processes like? There can be a border about accessibility, for instance. There can be a border about economics. There can be a border about support. There can be all kinds of borders about what's happening and what are those like to cross. And for me, it's always interesting to be aware of the multiple borders that are clearly present, and to give good time to think through what is it like to cross over that, and who are the formal and informal gatekeepers or the border keepers. Do they make it easy or difficult? And how do we speak about that clearly, and where relevant and where important, challenge people who are self-appointed border keepers, or even challenge formal border keepers that are more intent on a certain imagination policing than they are about education.
Mm. And do you think that the Hebrew Bible narratives help give hope or warning about the way that borders are policed or monitored, or how the borders inherent in our identity might be controlled or regulated by others? Is there hope? Is there warning? Is it both? Or is it more of something else?
I'll tell you, immediately I think of warning. I have spent a lot of time over the last number of years working with a colleague who very sadly died at the beginning of COVID, Glenn Jordan, working with him on doing a contemporary reading of borders, literal and metaphorical, through the lens of the Hebrew Book of Ruth, an extraordinary 4-chapter text about a displaced, widowed, foreign border crosser coming into a community. And she wasn't only displaced and foreign, she was from a kind of a neighboring but antagonized territory, a region between which the Moabite and Israelite territory, there was great antagonism and accusations going back and forth. And one of the things that it does is it opens up by saying, in the days of the judges. And so what I would consider to be an extraordinary piece of art is offering is to say that Ruth is arriving into Bethlehem, house of bread. Ruth is arriving into Bethlehem during a time when on her. She knows that because she had been married to a local man and he died, that she as a widow deserves social welfare. But because she's from a territory, an enemy territory, I suppose, there's questions as to whether she's the right kind of widow. And over again, she believes she is. And there's doubt and speculation as to whether she really is. Does she deserve the social welfare we say is for our own widows, or a worthy kind of widow? Who decides what a worthy kind of widow is? And taking that as a metaphor, there's a broad question as to who decides when borders are applied or when exceptions are made. And I think that that is the great warning that you find in Hebrew Bible. I admire so much that in the liturgy around Pesach, no, I got the name wrong, in the liturgy around Shavuot, called Pentecost in English, that the coming of the law of God to Moses on top of the mountain is read. This extraordinary idea of the law descending in these stone tablets coming from on high. And at the same time, in the same liturgy, the full text of the book of Ruth is read, which is to imply that the question as to how to act in the world, because law really is following the secret name of God. Law, Torah, is an embodied, vivacious, alive thing. That law comes both from on high, but also comes through the insight and intelligence and critique of a widowed, displaced border crosser from a place you might call enemy. And that, I think, is a liturgical and theological piece of brilliance about the question today about who is it that we believe when it comes to their experience of crossing a border. Do we believe our staff handbook, or do we believe the experience of a person who is saying this was fundamentally humiliating? And holding those two together, I think that Hebrew Bible proposes that always what we need to do is to amplify and to respect and to believe the incarnated narrative in a certain way. Like when you listen to the radio and you listen to these consumer affairs programs, often somebody will have had a terrible experience of a particular organization or business, and then the consumer affairs program will phone up that business, and the business will say something like, oh, you know, we don't comment on individual cases. And we're so used to hearing that and accepting that as an ethical response to go, okay, fair enough. But that actually, I think, is deeply contradictory to what you find in Hebrew Bible. What Hebrew Bible is saying is the individual case reveals the system, so comment on it. And what Hebrew Bible does is to amplify that in such an extraordinary way. And so therefore, I think that Hebrew Bible continually challenges anybody who finds themselves on the safe side of a border to think, how are you policing it? And is the policing easy? Or are you making exceptions that benefit you and your friends, and then also make negative exceptions that demean the lives of people you don't or don't want to care about?